to engage our thought for long duration tonight by looking around us at the world in order to ascertain the facts regarding the approaches of the devil upon the church and upon the people of God. We were just noting earlier this afternoon how that the government are now introducing new concepts in terms of homeschooling, and these new teachings will involve modern thought on gender and so on. And that if children are being homeschooled, the parents must fulfill the obligations and obey the instructions of government. These are the laws that are being pursued with great intent at the moment, so that even homeschooling is now coming under threat from the enemy of our souls. And the Bible tells us things will get worse and worse. There will come a time when to preach on sections of the Bible will be to be in breach of government regulation. And those who dare to do that will be in danger of being isolated and possibly incarcerated. It's happening across the world in different other parts. And we here in Australia are not immune to it. The devil is on the march. He is waving his banner high. And many there are who march to the beat of his drum as they head towards a lost eternity. It is important, therefore, that we as God's people know who we are, what God has made us, what God has in store for us, and how God has promised that He will never leave us, nor will He forsake us. Now, it's in the context of these thoughts that we want to just spend a moment looking particularly at verse 18. We have come through the teaching of the armour. We have looked at each piece deliberately and precisely and particularly. We have noted the need to adorn the armour of God. And now, coming into verse 18, we read, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. This is not a new concept. This is not an afterthought. This is not an additional comment. This verse forms the integral part of the entire passage, from verse 10 all the way through to this 18th verse. Here the Apostle Paul is reminding us that the armor is applied or put on in, through, by prayer. That lovely hymn, stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. There's one little part in one verse that says, each piece put on with prayer. That's exactly what Paul is teaching us here. This exhortation has reminded us of the need to put on the whole armour of God. And now Paul is drawing to the conclusion that prayer becomes the essential element. If our armour is to be effective and efficient, not only in our protection in terms of our defense, but also in terms of our offense. It is in reality linked to the full armor of God, and the fact that there are two things that we need to be able to do. One is that we need to be able to wear the armor. Now, that point has a significance when we remember when David went out to visit his brethren when they were engaged with the Philistine army. You remember Goliath, the giant, challenged the people of Israel. And no one was prepared because no one felt able to challenge or take the challenge of Goliath until David, the shepherd boy, arrived. And immediately he queried the unbelief and the timid faith of his brethren. And eventually, having suggested that he could become the champion of Israel, he was brought to King Saul. And remember how the first thing that Saul wanted to do when he knew that David was prepared to take up the challenge was to put on his armor. And as soon as the armor was put on, remember, David immediately took it off because he felt that he was not able to wear the armor of Saul. And the reason for that was that it was way too heavy. It was not the right armor in which to engage the enemy. In fact, David went out with no armor, save he was covered by the armor of God, unseen, but there for his protection. Now, when we go out to battle, the first thing that we need to ensure is that we are able to wear the armor of God. You see, the armor of God is made for the child of God. It will not fit a man or a woman of the world. It will offer no safety, no protection to the world. You cannot hide behind the armor of God if you are not enlisted in the army of God. But for every soldier, regardless of size, of stature, or of position, the armor of God will always fit. So we need to ensure, before we take on the enemy, that we are able to wear the armor of God. Remember those who tried to cast out the demons and they were almost torn to shreds. And remember the response of the demons. We don't know who they are. We need to have an identity as the people of God. And then, of course, having put on the armor, we need to be able to fight in it. We need to be able to move and to engage with the armor as our protection. So, here in verse 18, Paul is telling us this is how you make sure that the armor fits. This is how you make sure that you can be mobilized with the armor on. Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. What does that little comment, all prayer, mean? There are elements of prayer. And one of them is mentioned in this reference, supplication. But there are other elements of prayer. Is that what Paul means? Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. The all prayer that Paul is referring to here is not an action. It's an attitude. All prayer means, as in the words of that other lovely little hymn, what a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what needless pain. Now, oh, what we forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Paul is telling us here, prayer is an attitude. Many pray, but their prayers are not effective. The attitude of prayer is submission to the Father's will. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. How do we do that? James tells us we submit to God. So in submitting to God, we come under his power, under his authority. So, praying always with all prayer provides the attitude that enables the application of the armor of God. Then the next little thought on supplication in the Spirit. That is our contentions in prayer. That is our applications at the throne of grace and of mercy. That's our engagement. That's the yielding up of our desires and our concerns to God. So here we have in verse 18 this attitude, praying always. So you don't have to be praying always, but you must always be in the attitude of prayer. And that attitude will be one of submission to the will of God. Prayer helps us to put it on, and prayer helps us to keep it on. Now come over into Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6, and we'll read in the 6th chapter, the 4th verse. Romans 6, verse 4. Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father. Now note that that comment relates to what God has done in us and for us. Then we add, even so we also should walk in newness of life. So the working in the first part of the verse leads to the walking in the latter part. God does the working. We must do the walking. Let's read the verse again. Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. We are enabled to walk in newness of life because God has accomplished a work within our hearts. It is the power of God that enables us not only to put on the armor, but to work and to walk and to fight with the armor. So while God has already won the battle, and God willing, on Wednesday night at the Bible study, we're going to be looking a little bit more at the authority of Jesus, and as a consequence, the authority of believers. Our authority over the enemy because of the authority of Jesus. That's the thought and the point that Paul is drawing from Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 18. Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. That's what we do because God has given us the authority to do it. God has given us the power over the adversary, the devil. Read through those verses in chapter 14, 15, and 16 of John's Gospel and see just how often Jesus encourages his disciples with prayer. You pray and God will answer. And here this thought has been carried through in this 18th verse. If we took the time to go over into the first chapter of the book of Joshua, we would discover a very nervous young man being challenged to become the new leader of the work of God in the lives of his children, Israel. You'll find in that first chapter that God speaks carefully and confidently to young Joshua. Promise after promise is made that God will go before him. What did that mean to Joshua? It meant that somehow, whatever would meet him on the morrow, God had already been there, for he goes before. Whatever may arise from the distant horizon of the challenge of his life next week or the week after, God was already there. He had gone before. And what is the promise that God gives to Joshua? Verse 5 of Joshua chapter 1. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. That's a promise that God gives each one of us. And how are we to hold on to that